So we're very lucky to have Dr. Clara Mancini with us today. Dr. Mancini is a senior lecturer in interaction design at the Open University's School of Computing and Communications. She's founder and head of the OU's Animal-Computer Interaction Lab and is interested in design, methodological, and ethical challenges and opportunities presented by ACI. So thank you so much for being with us today. I can see that your screen sharing is working. So that's great. So over to you, Clara. Thank you.
Hi. Sorry, I was just trying to also unmute myself and share my camera. Okay. Well, thank you so much for having me here. It's a real pleasure. It's been truly a pleasure to follow the discussions and the presentations. So I'm going to try now to explore this idea of collaboration through what we do at the Open University's Animal-Computer Interaction Lab. So, well, let's get started then. So interactive technology, I've written my notes on the screen so people can also follow, just looking if there is audio issues or something. So interactive technology, it has been happening to animals for nearly a century. But it's near recent years that interaction designers have started to ask questions around these interactions, how these interactions may impact animals' well-being and social dynamics, and also about the usability of interactive systems and the animal's experience with them. So these questions are precisely the remit of the emerging field of animal-computer interaction, and which is a multidisciplinary field that is taking input from various fields, including biology, technology, and culture. So, consistent with ACI's multidisciplinarity, the ACI Lab was founded in 2011 on a mission to advance the art and science of designing animal-centered interactive systems for a participatory multi-species society. And we do this by pursuing three main aims. One is studying the interaction between animals and technology within their habitual context. This could be direct or indirect interactions. They could be dyadic or distributed, synchronous or asynchronous, passive or active, whatever they might be. We also aim to design computing technology that can improve animal welfare, that can support animals in their activities, and that fosters intra and interspecies relationships. And last but not least, we are very interested in informing animal-centered approaches to developing technology for and with animals. So today I wanted to try and look at some of the projects that we work on from a collaboration perspective. So just checking this there, I think that was in the way. So in particular, there's been discussions of biotelemetry in this workshop in particular. So I wanted to look at animals' influence on the design of passive interactions as a form of indirect collaboration, and hopefully that will tie in with the end of my presentation. In particular, this project was about improving the wearability of animal biotelemetry, and it used the doctoral work of Patrizia Paci. Okay, so biotelemetry is widely and increasingly used to track and monitor animals and can be very beneficial for conservation, research, and husbandry purposes. But the problem with it is that animal wearers, who are the primary stakeholders, have no control over the use of the technology. And also the problem is that the devices can interfere with their body and their activities, reducing their welfare and also reducing the quality of the data that is collected through their use. As a case in point, the ethological observation of cats' responses to commercial trackers like PawTrax and Tractive, which are commonly sold as being cat-friendly, show that those devices actually are not very cat-friendly. Patrizia observed a number of behavioral signs of discomfort, which is the increase in activities that at a normal level would be normal for cats, but like grooming, shaking, and scratching that increased with the presence of the device, and also behavioral signals of discomfort directed at the device themselves, like licking, coughing, biting, trying to take it off. So to address this, we developed a wearer-centered design framework for supporting the designer's systematic approach to the development of animal biotelemetry. So this framework is grounded on some fundamental values and some design principles, and requires that all stakeholders are considered. So the animal wearers, first of all, but also what we call their significant others, which includes their social and asocial relations, as well as human users. We need to consider the characteristics of the animals, their activity, and the characteristics of their environment. And we need to think about all of the possible design variables, not just weight and size, which is often what it is done with biotelemetry. And so here is an example on the screen of so if you're doing it for one variable only, which is the sound, the background sound of a tracking device. And if you're tracking a red fox, you need to make sure that the ground noise is not within, it's outside of the acoustic range, not only of the fox, but also of the prey animal of the fox and the predator of the fox. So by applying the framework to the design of a cat tracker resulted in a more wearable prototype, which did not elicit the negative responses to the device from the cat wearers who were fitted with it. So the same approach could be used to inform a design of biotelemetry where the direct collaboration or involvement of animals is difficult or undesirable on welfare grounds, which is typically the case for wildlife. So, but this is one way that the animals can actually, their characteristics, what they do spontaneously, can influence the way in which design technology that is intended for them. Now, I wanted to look at somewhere or a situation where the interaction between the animal and technology is more active and more direct. And this is in view of supporting a daily collaboration between human and animals, which is the case of mobility assistance dogs. So this project was, which is still ongoing since 2013, was about improving the environmental accessibility for these dogs. And it was in collaboration with the charity Dogs for Good, and also for the past few years been mainly the work of doctoral student Luisa Ruge. So these mobility assistance dogs are trained to interact with a wide range of everyday interfaces on behalf of their assisted humans. The problem is that they have to operate in an anthropocentric environment that, from a dog's perspective, contravenes the most fundamental interaction design principles. And here I've just listed a few: perceivability, consistency, affordance, feedback, that none of these are met by what the dogs are faced with. So the idea was to rethink how these interfaces are designed, and in particular mapping interaction design principles onto canine user sensory, cognitive, and physical characteristics in order to inform the design of canine-centered controls. For example, using color that the dog's diachromatic vision can see, designed controls of a large size to accommodate the dog's limited limb dexterity, for the controls to be very sensitive to the touch so that they can be comfortably operated by their snout, which is more spontaneous for dogs, and so that in order for them to be responsive, the whole, to be easy for the dogs to activate, the whole surface needs to be responsive. And finally, we have a wired version and a wireless version to maximize the flexibility of how these devices can be placed and position and accessed by the dogs who are the main users. So early deployment studies of these devices demonstrated, or actually, aside from the specific design of the device, how fundamentally important also the contextual elements are for the dog's ability to successfully engage with the controls. For example, we need a strong contrast with the background, so you need to choose the colors depending on where you're going to put them. the input and output spatial and temporal proximities is very important. So if the control is used to open an automatic door, and the control is right next to the door, the dog sees immediately the opening of the door as an effect of the triggering of the control. They can learn that. Whereas if you will use the control to operate neon lights on the ceiling, those will take time to come on and they are far away from the control, and that will make it harder for the dog to make any kind of connection. Also, having one input for one output is very important. So using one control for switching on and off a light becomes problematic because there isn't a univocal pairing between input and output. So these things were very important. Now, understanding the usability of a design is essential in interaction design, and measuring various aspects of the dog's interactions with different door opening controls enabled us to gather their feedback on the usability of our prototypes against standard controls. I've included a few parameters here just as an example, but actually Luisa measured many more of these. It did turn out that our controls were more usable, but this is just about usability. So how easy it is for the dogs to use these controls. Equally important in interaction design is understanding the user experience. And so Luisa, together with visiting fellow Elizabeth Cox, developed a tail wagging ethogram that allowed us to, make a rough and preliminary assessment of the dog's experience during the interaction, on the grounds that the tail tends to express, at least to an extent, and obviously in combination with other aspects of body language, the affects of the dog. But this needed to be done against the baseline of the dog's individual personality. So for that, Luisa and Liz used the Monash-Cannon personality questionnaire revised, because obviously if a dog is generally, neurotic or extrovert, they may tend to wag their tail in a slightly different way. We need to take that into account. So that's now in the wild deployment of our latest prototypes has highlighted not only the value that the controls have for the human-dog partnerships, not only to enable them to work together to perform daily functions, but also provided them with opportunities for shared learning and bonding, which I thought was quite nice. We installed this in a restaurant to operate the toilet of the accessible doors. And also we gave the wireless controls to some households for them to use for different appliances. And so far we received positive comments, but this is still work in progress, so we will have to see how things progress. Now I wanted to focus on another kind of collaboration, which is a more specialized kind of collaboration, and how we can support human-animal communication within this context by recentering practices to support the work of biodetection dogs. So this is a project in collaboration with the charity Medical Detection Dogs, and various researchers have been involved in these for a number of years now. So biodetection dogs are trained to recognize and indicate the presence of organic volatile compounds from diseased cells in biological samples. Firstly, through operant conditioning, the dogs learn to recognize an odor as salient and develop a spontaneous response to the stimulus that has become salient. This is called stimulus response. Then they are learned to communicate their assessment about the odor's presence using a conventional signal, for example, sitting down in front of a positive sample. And this is called the operant response. This is very useful for the handler because it communicates unambiguously the decision of the dog to communicate. However, there is two problems with this method. So the operant response, because it is conventional, it only allows the dog to express binary responses, no nuances really, not intentionally. And so, but the level of concentration of volatiles in a sample could vary, and that could be meaningful, and we have no way of knowing with this system. And also using a conventional signal that is not part of the dog's spontaneous response to the odor of interest imposes a translation overhead on the dog that lowers the reliability of their response. So what we did, we went through a design journey that unfortunately I don't have time to go through now, but you're very welcome to ask me questions about it. But the bottom line is that we hypothesized that there would be a correlation between the dog's interest in the sample's content and the interaction with the sample, and the content itself, the volatiles that would be, the quantity of volatiles that would be in the sample. So we modified the stand on which the samples are usually presented to the dogs in order to embed pressure sensors in them. Now, by using pressure sensors to record the dog's interaction with the samples, allowed us to capture their spontaneous and nuanced stimulus response. Here I have an example, very short. This is a dog with, whoops, sorry. Let's try again. Okay, I don't know if you've noticed, but the dog interacts with the second stand very differently from the way he interacts with the first stand. The second stand contains, offers a positive sample, whereas there is a negative sample on the first stand. So we are starting to notice that there is some external consistency between dogs in patterns. So the pressure data is revealing some specific to individuals, but consistent patterns in the stimulus response of those individuals. We have even identified some sort of different phases into the patterns of to the positive sample. One is an entry, first inspection, then a confirmation and an exit pattern. Now we also notice that there is some internal consistency within dog based on the concentration that the samples of the samples. As this varies, the patterns of positive response also tend to vary. The pressure data also suggests that shows us the pattern abnormalities for false positives. So those cases in which actually the sample is negative, but the dog signals as though it was positive. And this is even though the dog has produced a positive response. So these differences would be hard to detect without the technology. So we envisage that in substance, we envisage that the current center automatic classification of the dog stimulus response will enable us to shift the translation burden from the dogs to the system and capitalize on the dog's capacities and knowledge. We already have some promising preliminary results with machine learning classification, and to enrich the picture that we gather through the data in our data, we have included proximity sensors and also microphones to capture the sniffing activity and the approach and the departure, hoping that this will give us additional information. Now I wanted to look at another aspect, another dimension, if you like, of collaboration, which is a direct research collaboration between dogs and humans. And this was in the context of a project. It was about empowering medical alert dogs in emergencies. This was the work of Charlotte Robinson with co-supervisor Janet van der Linden. And it was, again, a project done in collaboration with medical detection dogs. So medical alert dogs are trained to recognize and alert their assisted humans to the signs of an upcoming medical crisis. For example, the hypoglycemic attack for a person who suffers from diabetes. So the human can take remedial action in time. But sometimes the condition is so brittle that the human is not able to respond, and maybe they slip into a coma or something, which leaves the dog powerless to help further. And this is very dangerous for the human, but also very distressing for the dog. So we wanted to design a canon-centered alarm system that would enable the dogs to call for help remotely, interacting with it as an autonomous users. And this is quite different from the work that mobility assistance dogs do, because that's always somehow with the guidance of the human. In this situation, the dog is on their own. So we needed something that was safe and efficient for the dogs to trigger, and really, really easy for the dogs to learn and to remember how to use. And we wanted a neutral experience, because we didn't want the dog to be afraid of interacting with it. We didn't want the dog to have fun with it, because they might then trigger it just for the fun of it. So we had figured out that we would need something like this, an electronic component that would do all the work of sending the alert out to perhaps a family friend, mobile phone or something. And then we had a Canon interface well away from the electronic component. And this was composed of a trigger that connected the electronic module, to a biteable tag that the dog could grab in his mouth, and his or her mouth, and then pull. Now, we still had a lot of questions to answer. For example, what should be the resistance of the trigger? What should be the size, the material, the shape of the tag? And should this tag be detachable or remain attached as the dog pulled? So in order to figure out the answers to these questions, Charlotte worked really a long time with the dogs, using rapid, what we call also quick and dirty prototyping, to engage with them in physical conversations, to enable them to make design choices. So she used modular prototypes in which, for example, a block of wood was standing for the electronic module, and in which she used very different types of trigger, of connectors, and different types of tag, and then swapping these, having these alternatives and permutating rapidly these different alternatives over a number of iterations. She was able to get the dogs effectively to demonstrate what they preferred and what they didn't prefer. And so it turned out that at the end of the process, that the dogs preferred a setup that was nice, simple, and tidy. They wanted a detachable tag, and if they didn't get it, they would destroy the thing, which turned out to be very valuable as a form of feedback that they had actually triggered the alarm and the job was done. And we realized we needed customizable tags, because depending on the age, the size, the stage of the dog in their training, they might need something a bit more toy-like, or a bit more, if you like, adult-like. So here is just the deployed prototype with an individual dog that's been customized for the preferences of that particular medical alert dog. So now, so to stress the importance of and the value of doing rapid prototyping and over a period of iterations, I just wanted to very quickly put up a slide about a project that was the doctoral work of Fiona French. It was about designing acoustic interactive enrichment for captive elephants. So when working with animals who are physically and socially so unfamiliar to us, they are not like cats and dogs who live among us. Really, we're not used to living among them, most of us at least. So rapid prototyping and iteration is absolutely critical. And in Fiona's case, it really taught us a lot of lessons about the role of aesthetics in the elephant's responses. So as you see here, there are various pictures of very different prototypes that Fiona developed, really guided by the level of attention and interest that the elephants were showing to the tactile qualities of the prototypes, to the shape and maybe the position, and the order, and all these things. And you can only figure these things out if you work in this way, if you produce many prototypes and you offer them, and then just see what the response of the animal is. One of the elephants she worked with you know, she would rip things off if she didn't, you know, if she thought that that was, you know, was interesting for her, or if she didn't like something. So it was very much a case of working with the elephant, and you can't, you know, you really have to go along with an elephant. There isn't much, how can I say, negotiating that you can do. So now, if we working with the animals, but how that raises the question, of course, of what is an ethical way of collaborating with animals. And this is something that you know, that has been very dear to me since the very beginning of the ACI lab. So here I just wanted to focus on how the on the development of an animal-centered ethics for ACI that we use at the ACI lab. So this was prompted by the fact that current legal frameworks for animal research present substantial limitations for ACI from an animal-centered perspective, as they are process-centered rather than animal-centered. For example, not all species are protected, only vertebrates, for example. Research does not have to be relevant to the subjects. And essentially, individuals are involved as part of scientific apparatus, etc. So ACI really requires a very different approach. And in particular, ACI from our perspective requires a user-centered ethics, which means that we can only work with animals for whom the technology is directly relevant and beneficial. And I'm talking particular, ideally the individuals, not the species. It requires a participant-centered ethics, which means that we need to protect everyone involved in virtue of their role, not their characteristics, which might be sex, age, species, whatever. So it's just because they are taking part that they get, you know, sort of that they need this protection, or we want them to be protected. And ACI, I would say, needs a welfare-centered ethics. And we take this definition from Marian Stamp-Dawkins, the biologist Marian Stamp-Dawkins, which means that we must protect animals' health and ensure that they have what they want, because these are the two pillars that Marian Stamp-Dawkins proposes as a, you know, as a basic for good welfare. So in essence, therefore, working within an animal-centered ethics means that we must always respect the animal's autonomy and safeguard their integrity by working in contexts that are habitual for the animals, by being unobtrusive and undisruptive of their activities, by giving them control and space for expression, and by using only positive forms of interaction. In other words, an animal-centered ethics means that the interests of the individual animal take priority over the interests of science and society, which is exactly the type of protection that you are required to give to humans, particularly humans who are considered vulnerable and non-competent, who cannot give you full informed consent. But on the topic of consent, this is also very important for us. And we have two ways of garnering consent, or that's what we, you know, of trying to garner consents. One we call a mediated consent, which entails obtaining consent from humans who know the animal well and understand the implications of their involvement, and who have their best interests at heart and the legal authority to decide on their behalf. But this doesn't exempt from asking the animals themselves, and we call this contingent consent. So the animal is the only one who can assess those contingencies. And so this entails enabling the animals as much as possible to continually assess the situation they might be in and to choose what they do. And we need to respond to that. So we also need to monitor them appropriately and responding to their manifestation of dissent if there are any. So the problem is, of course, that sometimes ACI researchers work in contexts in which animals have not chosen to be, and in which their integrity and autonomy are already severely compromised. So what do? I would suggest that we can still operate within the bounds of an animal-centered ethics to protect the integrity and respect the autonomy of the animals as far as we interact with them, as far as we can. and that we do this is important, that we do engage is important, so that we can get in those small spaces, we can give them a voice as research participants, which can eventually and hopefully lead to change. Now, but can animals be regarded as participants in ACI research? Now, here there's been a bit of a debate in ACI, and some say no, the animals cannot share or determine design goals because there is an unbridgeable communication gap and an irreducible power asymmetry between humans and animals. Therefore, they cannot be considered real participants. Others say yes, they can be considered such, but only if the animals can engage entirely freely. So any conditioning, for example, through training, would be manipulative, and any constraints imposed by the research context would be coercive. Now, is this true? Now, a colleague and I wanted to explore the boundaries of this question. And so here, the last part of my presentation that I wanted to go over is how we could redefine participation in multi-species collaboration. And in particular, how could we define multi-species participatory spaces for multi-species interaction design? And this was my colleague, this was done in collaboration with my colleague, Hugh Letonen, and my dog, Zina. So it is just a small case study, but just to, it's just to explore these questions. We worked with Zina to train her to successfully interact with our prototype door opening and light switching controls that I sort of talked about earlier. So in this period, Zina was, our sessions were very short. There were many breaks. She was free to engage or not engage. She was, she had a resting place with water. She was fed normally, walked normally. We only used food and a positive reinforcement in the form of food. So here I just wanted to show you 4 short video clips to try and walk you through the process that we went through, and to try and see if I can illustrate a couple of points. Let's see if that works. Sorry, I think that went. Okay, no, it's a bit stubborn. Okay, let me see if in this, if it works like this. Okay, unfortunately, the video doesn't seem to work. It was working earlier. I don't know why it's not working now. I'll check if this next one works. If not, I'm just going to have to read the text to you. It doesn't seem to work. I think it may be an issue with sharing the... Okay, I'm so sorry. I don't know why it's not working, but it works when it is offline, but it seems that, so I'm going to start the video to see if you can at least hear the sound, and then I'll see if I can read. I will just tell you what's happened. Okay, it's not, this doesn't even work. Let me try again. Okay, so here in this first video, I tried to cue Zina with my finger to nudge the yellow door opening control next to the little door at the bottom. But my cue is meaningless to her, and instead she's focused on the treats in my pouch. So she interprets my gesture. I do a downward gesture towards that yellow sort of control, and she interprets that as a down command. But her response does not obtain her the treats, because that's not what I'm asking. So she pants and licks her lips and jumps up in a begging behavior. So I interpret Zina's behavior as expressing anticipation and frustration, and I respond by rewarding her just for turning towards the controls, just to get her interested. Obviously, I'm not a professional trainer, but this was partly the point, to see the point where things didn't work. Now, in the next, In the next clip, which probably is not going to work either. So we are already making some progress. So to help her associate her touching the control with the reward, I place, every time I ask her to touch the control, I place the treat on top of the control so that when she goes for the treat, she simultaneously triggers it. So this creates a bias towards not interaction to make the opening of the door more relevant for her. My colleague Jussi goes behind the door and gives her a treat through the door whenever this opens. Once she's made these associations, then I only reward after she has triggered the control. So now we have another video, and I don't know. This seems to work. So now I'm trying to persuade Zina to touch the yellow light switching control, which is much higher, and so a much more demanding task. So she has done this a few times already, and here she does it one more time, but then she refuses to continue. And she sits down looking at me in a baggy behavior instead. So that's what she's about to do now. Okay, so let's see if this last clip works. So here, yes, Zina is still refusing to engage with the light switching control. So I could offer her a higher value reward to persuade her, but keeping the reward constant tells us that there is an effort threshold that we should not pass. Instead, I ask her to touch the lower door opening control, and in spite of the bias towards the snout interaction that I created earlier, by placing the control, the treat on top of the control, she chooses to use her paw. So she understands what the task entails, but she elects to do it in her own way. So apologies for the previous videos not working. And I hope that this has given some idea of how we went through a process of what this friend would call it gradual attunement, and how we making with, in which we were both actively engaged. We were semiotically engaged in that we were trying to make sense of each other's signals, sometimes not correctly. It involved volitional engagement in that there was something each of us wanted. They were not the same things, but we both were engaged in pursuing what we wanted. And our engagement involved choicefulness. It was choiceful engagement in that there were different ways that we could each engage. And for example, Zina could decide whether to work or not, to work how much of a reward, or to engage in proposed modalities of engagement or in her own chosen modalities. So this is really an open-ended process of incremental orientation through iteration, which is typical of interaction design and which makes room for failures and mistakes and which builds on it. And which entails, in which the details of the research setups do matter and can be defined, we suggest, along 4 basic dimensions of a multi-species participatory model. So these dimensions are biological salience. So the research setups should offer something of what is salient for each participant, what each participant wants. It doesn't have to be the same for all participants, but there needs to be something for everybody. Signal reliability is also very important, and it's to do with semiosis, and it is to enable all the participants to make sense, even their own sense, of the situation and what the others are doing. And of course, engagement option, which relates to choice and which is very important to be able to understand then which way forward are best. So this could be, choosing, as I was saying, different ways of engaging or not engaging, etc. And of course, contingency variation means that these would be variations along the 3 dimensions of biological salience, signal reliability, and engagement options. For example, you can decide to vary the reward, or you can, you can ask a task that is more or less challenging, etc. And all of these helps you figure out what the next step could be. And it doesn't have, it doesn't give a full picture, but it does give you something to decide what does this animal want, or what do I think, what is, this suggests that the animal may want. So engaging with animals, my final message would be that engaging with animals in compromised realities, that's what we do. We work in compromised realities to gradually change these realities with the animals' participation is, in my view, possible. And to that end, models of participations that are more inclusive and resilient to diversity are needed in order to facilitate the emergence of incrementally co-constructed futures. The idea, so setting the bar too high for what constitutes participation, that runs the serious risk of those who don't meet don't reach that threshold to be dismissed as no participants. And that could result in their voices not being considered legitimate voices and not being listened to. And with that, I conclude my presentation. Thank you so much. Apologies again for those videos that didn't play, and I'll be very happy to take any questions.
Great, thank you so much, Clara. That was just so interesting and incredibly relevant to the conversations we've been having last week and this week. So thank you. Before we open things up for broader discussion and questions, we're going to hear from our two discussants. So we're lucky to have Drs. Beth Greenhough and Alice Hovorka join us today. So first, we're going to hear from Dr. Greenhough, who's an associate professor of human geography at Oxford and employs a range of qualitative, ethnographic, and archival methods to understand the social, cultural, and ethical processes through which humans and animals are made available as experimental subjects. So thank you, Beth.
Hi everybody, and huge thanks to Lauren, Jenny and Johnny for the chance to join the conversation today, and to Clara for such a fascinating insight into human-animal computer interaction. I've really enjoyed this opportunity to engage with Clara's research, and in particular explore how it's underpinned by this commitment to animal-centered ethics, as someone who works a lot on human-animal relations in ASPA research, so in labs. And I think how her work seeks to go beyond the kind of conventional, utilitarian and welfare-centered regulations that currently govern animal research offers some really interesting, promising ways for thinking forward how we work with animals in the future. Things like we should only approach animals to participate in research that's of benefit to them, that this should take place in their habitual environments, and that we should seek these forms of mediated and contingent consent. That's also thrown up for me quite a lot of challenges in how we take this forward in other sectors. So I'm going to use my 10 minutes to think through some of those challenges. And I get the sense that many of these are ones I think Clara's also wrestled with. So some of them you picked up on. So it'd be great to hear your thoughts as well as everyone else's is on these. The first one is probably one of the most obvious ones. It's around speciesism. So a lot of the animals we've talked about today are what Myra Hurd would call big like us, predominantly mammals. They've got a lot of what Jamie Loren would call non-human charisma. And this reflects a really consistent bias in the species we as humans tend to care about. It's one that's reflected in the legislation, it's reflected in the kinds of animals we work with, the ones we spend most time researching and the ones we're arguably most attuned to. So as someone who works in labs, I was wondering how we begin to develop animal-centered ethics for working with, say, zebrafish, one of the most widely used research species in the UK. How do we even motivate people to care about what zebrafish care about in the first place, especially given things as straightforward as their capacity to suffer or feel pain is still up for scientific debate? So I'm in conversations trying to convince people that fish need pain relief, for example. So the second challenge for me is around, and I think Clara picked up on this really well, so I went on it, contingent consent in captivity. If we think about things like lab environments or farming environments, these are already sort of very compromised places, and just being in those environments is often a welfare loss for the animals. So is consent even possible? I think Clara picked up this in a context of domestication, when we've bred animals to be docile, to kind of want to work with us in some ways. And in captivity, when an animal might choose or appear to choose to do something just because it's the lesser of two evils. They're so bored they'll try anything almost. So those are, and I think Clara, you picked up on that challenge really well with the chicken image. The one we didn't dwell so much on was the idea of mediated consent, which I understand is how we can't ask the animals, so we ask those who we think speak to their interests. So we ask the animal welfare expert, or we ask the owner. And one of the challenges that I've seen in conversations with vets is that we think they might know the animal's best interest, but often particularly owners don't. So they might encourage or consent to things because they think it's best for the animal, even though animal welfare science or ethology might tell us otherwise. This usually leads into a rant about supervet, but that's a whole different set of problems. Okay. Fourthly, what about the animals we can't flourish with? So some of the challenges for people who work with species like grey squirrels or signal crayfish, if you work with these species, particularly if you bring them into captivity, you're obliged to kill them. So participation for them is pretty lethal. Yet at the same time, if we choose not to work with them, if we exclude them, then we're also excluding them from the benefits that engaging in research might bring. So one of the things I've noticed, one of the ironies of animal research is that the more we work with animals, the more we learn about them, the more attuned we become to their interests. And if we exclude some species for whatever reason, what do they lose in those exclusion? Who's excluded and at what cost? Fifthly, what other obligations might animal-centered ethics place on those who engage in an experiment? So, for example, those who research with wild animals often adopt a principle of non-interference, because they're thinking not just about the relationship with an individual, but with a species and even with an ecosystem. So they've got ethical responsibilities for the ecosystem. Might it be in the animal's interest to engage in research to gain benefits that aren't necessarily those linked to the experiment, but things like food or play, which aren't directly linked to experimental outcomes as well? And then finally, and sort of relatedly, who is the object of animal-centered ethics? We've talked a lot about the individual. We've also earlier on talked about the social group as an object of animal-centered ethics, the species, or even, as I just suggested, the ecosystem. And as I was thinking about this, I was reminded of Lewis Holloway's work on automatic milking machines and how the benefits of engaging with that particular technology were unevenly distributed in a herd. Dominant cows tended to do much better out of it than undominant ones. Clara gives a great example of a hypothetical, I think it's hypothetical ACI, which helped an endangered tiger to catch deer more efficiently, which is, as she put it, was great for the tiger and not so great for the deer. I'm thinking on a more practical level of arguments about the use of things like live bait in animal research. Or even coming from a fish lab context, I'm so busy worrying about the ethics of working with the fish. What about the brine shrimp, which is seen as a form of environmental enrichment for the fish? So they're there to make the fish happier, but at what cost to the brine shrimp? So yeah, lots of possibilities and lots of challenges. And yeah, thanks so much. It was a really great talk and really great work as well. Thank you, Clara.
Thank you. What a wonderful discussion.
Yeah, thank you so much, Beth, for your thoughts. And I think what we'll do is have Alice share her thoughts first, and then Clara, whatever of those threads you want to pick up on would be great. So next we'll hear from Dr. Alice Hovorka, Professor and Dean at the Faculty of Environmental and Urban Change at York University. She leads the SSHRC-funded Lives of Animals Research Group, which applies interdisciplinary and action-oriented approaches to study human-animal relations in Botswana, Canada, and Costa Rica. So over to you, Alice.
Thank you. Thank you, Lauren, Jenny, and Johnny for just a great 2 days. I have taken on more administrative roles of late, so this is just luxurious for me. So thank you so much. And I want to thank Beth for the great comments just now, and especially to Clara, who over the last few weeks, I've gotten to know your research a lot more through various video clips I've watched and research I've been reading. And I'm really struck by the way in which your lab is truly a multi-species lab environment, you know, and I think you are you're moving forward in a really positive direction around these models of participation amongst different kinds of beings. I think there's an ethic of care here that speaks to not only the topical work that you're doing on really trying to enhance human-animal relationships and engage the talents of animals in assisting humans. But also, I saw a video clip of you where you talked about, and you might have said it earlier, but my internet clicked out, so I missed the very start of your talk. But in one of the videos I saw, you talked about how important it is to bring, to invite animals to the design table.
Oh, yes.
And to be as designers in there. And I would say, yeah, designers, collaborators, scientists, helping us co-produce knowledge. And so my first point that I wanted to, that your work really invokes for me, is coming back to a theme that was brought up a few times today already by Adam, by Joshua, and a few others around labor and work of animals. And I think I was looking at your lab, Clara, as this, as a positive direction and where we're moving with lab animals. I'm going to put it into that context. I remember being one of my first experiences in a research lab was in a primate lab, where the group was working with macaques, and these macaques had been given strokes. And so these were stroked animals, and then they were there to press buttons and react to different tasks. And I remember the research group talking about those animals, those macaques, as workers and labor, and they are here to do a job. And I'm really struck at how differently your engagement is with these said workers or with these collaborators. And I think this is where we start to push our way into less about workers, exploited, oppressed, into workers, collaborators, and those non-humans that might have jobs in our society, and I still will call it a human society. But in the last few years, I've been really struck by the work coming out from Kendra Coulter of humane jobs for animals. Can there be jobs that, yes, they might serve humans, but they're also good for the animals? They tap into their skills, into their interests, into their, perhaps their own passions to help others, to be engaged with humans. And I think for me, this is an opportunity to explore the extent to which there can be jobs that we can engage animals with. And in this case, in the lab, or even potentially in the field. So these are not just lab-based experiments, but you're also working with animals and all kinds of other collaborators in the field to help animals do their jobs better, et cetera, et cetera. So it does raise this interesting question about animal labor and perhaps how your work is, again, pushing us into a different paradigm of how we think about animals as the co-producers of knowledge and technology and assistance to humans. So that was one point that I wanted to bring up. The second point has to do with this idea of complexity. And I'm going to go back to something that Cornelia Bernstein had said last week. And she had talked about how can we navigate triangular collaborations. And Cornelia was talking about it in terms of humans, animals, and plants. And I've been really struck by, I'm on a real technology thing these days. And so it's great that I've been given the opportunity to be a discussant here, because I'm wondering how we can think about and navigate a triangular collaboration that is human, animal, and technology. And there's something about, I'm starting to wonder, can we really get to know the lives of animals without technology? Like, is there anything, like how, I don't know, it seems to, it's a language that we're creating, helping create. It is a distance that we are shrinking. We're closing that gap. And this comes back to Beth's point around speciesism, because there's certainly animals that we don't need as much technology to get to know, and there's others that we really do. I've had some, in my own work, I've had some really great experiences working with students. Lauren Van Patter and Martha Geiger is here, who really try to get to know the animals, and they've gotten to know either dogs, companion animals, or donkeys, and they're able to be with them and work with them. In the animals that are further away from us, the wild animals, so Lauren could talk about her urban coyote research, or my own work with another doctoral student, Valley Fraser Sterlin, where we were trying to get to know the lives of African wild dogs. We never saw a dog because we couldn't find them. And we had to rely on another research group in another part of Botswana who had tracked all the animals with the collars, right? So, but there's something about how can we get to know animals without the technology that I'm starting to wonder about. And the final point I'll make is about difference. So I'm struck by this idea of who gets to collaborate and who does not get to collaborate. And in turn, what animal realities are we narrating, storying, mapping, engaging? Clara, you talked about this in terms of your, the user focus, participant focus, welfare focus is really focused on an individual. And this theme has also come out a few times today. Actually, is it Michael Overton? M. Overton is what your tagline reads, but you had quipped in the chat about working with piglets versus working with adult animals. And to me, that's actually really important. It's about the positionality of the animal, the experience of that animal, and the extent to which they're able to or want to collaborate. So in Clara's work, it's clear that there's certain animals that are just really good at detection work. They're just really good at interacting with people. There's some that are not. So are we only then looking at the realities of certain animals? So within a species, certain dogs are going to be part of your lab and others will not. Is that good? Is that bad? Who do we miss? And when we then think about companion animals, food or domesticated animals, wild animals, whose realities again, who's the collaborator? Is it all elephants, or is it the one elephant that has had a massive collar or tracking device put on them? And is that representative of a species? So these are some of the other things I think for you, Clara, in terms of your lab, it's which dogs get to participate, and how might you even control for that, or what claims can you make based on one animal's experience, etc. Okay, so those are a few thoughts. A wonderful couple of days. Thank you so much, and I look forward to the rest of the conversation.
Great. Thank you so much for those thoughts, Alice. So I'll turn things over to Clara. You can maybe address any of those comments or questions as you'd like, and then we'll bring things out to the broader group.
So there have been many fantastic points made, and I really would like to thank you both for such thoughtfulness and so taking the time to look into this work and respond to it so so thoroughly and insightfully and very helpfully as well. So I'll do my best to pick up on it, but I'll pick up on some points that I and then of course you can ask if I haven't explored a point sufficiently. I'm very happy to be told, and I'll do my best to explore it better. I think one of the first points was around Beth, you made about who the mediated consent and who is good, who is actually able to give consent for the animals. And it is a very good point. That's a very fair point, and that's partly why the contingent consent is absolutely essential. But there are aspects about the implication of the animals involved in the research, that the animal cannot, does not have the information, if you like, to assess. And sometimes the mediated consent, precisely because of what you said, because the owners sometimes are not necessarily, have all the picture. So you may need in our protocol, the protocol that we use, we talk about roles, competencies for providing mediated consent. So those competencies might be concentrated in one or two individuals, or they might be distributed on multiple individuals, maybe the legal competence, the everyday knowledge of the animal, the expert knowledge of the species. So you combine, you kind of have to have all of those facets in order to have adequate mediated consent. So that very much depends on the specific situation of the, on the animal, etc. And so, but even when you have all of those, you still need the animal to give you the, to be the one to say, yeah, I'm okay, I'm okay with this, I'm happy to engage, or no. So that was one of the things that I was, that I wanted to clarify. The other, I mean, you made so many very, very interesting points. One was, for example, probably not in order, but one was about who, and I think, Alice, you also raised this. So who do we work with? What if working with species that we are not so attuned with, or that we don't know, we don't have access to? And I think these are very major challenges. I mean, I get quite, when people, I think in my university, people like the work that the ACI Lab does, but many people misunderstand that as us wanting to help people. And I always have to make the point, no, I'm not interested in that. That's a great thing, but that's a byproduct. Actually, I am interested in changing the way we see animals and the way we support animals. So I think, mobility assistance dogs can have a great job, but only if they have the tools that they are suitable for them, that they are just like anyone of us. If we have a task, we need the tools that are appropriate for us. Now, we tend to work with, so what we try to do is for the animal, but it's true that it's easier to start from the animals that society values more, not because we care more about those, but because to get funding to do a project, to get interest, to get permission to do things, you kind of have to, you have to deal with all the politics around the work that you're trying to do. Now, I was talking in my presentation about trying to carve or to open little spaces in which you have wiggle room with the animals, to give the animals some opportunity to express who they are, what they want. And I think that is less than ideal, but it is a beginning. So I am very keen on working with other, I love dogs. I have dogs myself. I think they're great, but sometimes I also maybe I've had a bit enough for working with dogs. I'd love to work with other animals as well, because I'm interested in the variety. I'm interested in the variety, or in exploring the boundaries of of animal-computer interaction and human-animal interaction in different contexts where there are greater challenges. And but there are practical problems, who, like you were saying, and you both in different ways. I think, Beth, you were more saying about the species that we are attuned, the species that we don't live easily with, or that, we are obliged to kill, if not obliged, but legally then get killed if we engage with them any closely. or the problem of actually reaching them. I'm not sure that I have an answer. I guess the approach that I would tend to take in my work, and we tend to take in the lab, is that we're trying to develop a range of approaches for working. For example, the design of biotelemetry that can be done, if we have a framework that allows us to take into account, a lot of things about the animal, then perhaps we don't need to work with them so closely, and so we don't need to bother them, we don't put them at risk. We reach them in some other way. But of course, in order to have the elements to do that work, to have, to apply the framework, we need some knowledge about the animal. And it's true that, as Alice was mentioning, that technology has provided a lot of these knowledge. The use of technology has also impacted the animals, not necessarily in a positive way. And one example is the issue of privacy, the privacy of animals. And this work that a piece of work we've just finished, but with Patricia and another colleague. But there is a paradox of monitoring the animal for knowing them, for protecting them, at the same time, and sometimes even for protecting their privacy, which seems a paradox. So, but these are the contradictions that we kind of need to we are living with. And to me, I guess, because I don't want to take too much time, but to me, the key is where we are heading, what we are trying to do. And I was saying earlier in the presentation, the great thing about interaction design is that the failings, the errors, the go back to the drawing board and start again and have another go, are built into the process. And I think that's, to me, that's extremely valuable as a paradigm, because we are very, interaction designers are very aware that you design something, you prototype it, you put it out there, you try, there will always be issues thrown out. But even the way you think about things, you always are ready to go back to the drawing board. But the good thing is that even if you design and put there something that is all wrong, you have learned something, and that helps you to take the next step. I don't know, I'm not doing much justice to all the fantastic points that you both have made, but hopefully, I don't know, I've been able to offer something in return. And I think it is a mess. It is a mess. But as Haraway would say, we need to stay with the trouble. We need to just try and work our way through it little by little. We may not be able to give a global answer but we may give answers in specific contexts and situations, so long as we know what we are about, what we are trying to do, and that's clear. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much, Clara, and thank you to Beth and Alice again for your thoughts as well. So I think what we'll do is we'll open things up to a broader discussion. So anyone who has questions now for Clara or for any of our other panelists or speakers today, you can feel free to unmute yourself and jump in and ask a question. There are lots of questions up on the mural board as well, so we can always look there. But I'll just say, does anyone want to start out with a question? All right, maybe before we move on, there's a couple of here for Clara in particular. One of them I'll just read out, says, fascinating projects. Do you think the canine interface and the prototyping feedback is best understood as an imprinted stimulus response framework, or as part of an instance of a relationship of care and concern? And would that make a difference in practice?
I am not sure, actually. I'm not sure that I have an answer, and I'm not sure if that makes a difference. So when is the question, I don't know if the person who asked the question, if they would like to elaborate on it, whether is it to do with how the dog learns, you know, how the dog develops the stimulus response, or is it to do with some other aspects of the project? I wonder if, oh,
Yes,
Claire?
it was, yeah, that was me.
Yes,
thank you.
please.
Thank you for a great talk, and all your work, of course. Yeah, because you mentioned the process of training the dog involved this kind of reward, and you spoke about in terms of the stimulus response relationship, and at the same time it seemed that the issue for the dogs may also be the kind of stress that they experience when something happens to the person they're monitoring, and that they can't respond to. So that in that sense, their response and their behavior is also part of this relationship of care, rather than just, you know, being imprinted with this response.
Sure. So those are two different situations. So I should clarify that biodetection dogs never ever work on people. So they only work with samples. So there is a detachment, if you like, it's like they are, it is just analyzing samples in a lab, that sort of thing. And their relationship is with their handler, with their trainers, and with the foster families they live with, etc. They go to the office in the morning and they go home in the evening, just like anybody, so that's what. Whereas the medical alert dogs live with one individual, and they are, really closely, very closely bonded with that individual, and they know the odor of the individual really well. So any tiny variations on that, obviously, that's the trigger for them. That is a signal for them. And so those are the dogs who get distressed if something happens to the person. And so there is very much a care, a bond and a care relationship between the two. There is, of course, also the fact that they've learned by operant conditioning that once there is a change of a certain type, it's a bad sign. It's bad news. So, but that doesn't, in a way, because we cannot talk to dogs like we would talk to another human being. We cannot express abstract concepts, communicate abstract concepts in the same way. The process of operant conditioning is actually a way of communicating with them. So I'm telling you, by rewarding you when you pay attention to this, I am telling you that this is what I'm interested in. And by rewarding you when you are doing a certain behavior that will signal me, I am telling you, yes, this is how I know what you know. So it is effectively a communication process between the two, between the handler and the dog. So they are both involved, even in the medical alert work, so of the dogs who live with the one individual. But definitely, I would say the bond then becomes the more important aspect of the relationship, the bond of care.
Great, thank you so much. So I'm just looking at some of the comments on the mural here. I think there's one other question about arts and science. I'm not sure if the person who asked that would like to jump in and ask, otherwise I can read it. I'll just read. So you said in your presentation, advancing the art and science, and someone commented that that's interesting phrasing concerning the creativity involved in both art and science. And could you speak to this more and those involved?
So that's in a way that is very much where interaction design sits, if you like. So we use scientific approach like experimental protocols and etc. to test hypotheses, to do, and so we use scientific methods to learn things, but we also need to use to be creative and to be a bit more artistic when we design things that we then want to offer and test the validity of which, or is then tested using a scientific method. So it's a combination. And again, I think interaction design is really interesting in that, because it sits in this in-between space where it's neither just one thing or another. And for me, this phrase, the art and science, it comes from a quote from Leonardo da Vinci, who is my hero, scientist, scholar of all times. So, but at some point he said something like, you need to study the art of science and the science of art, or something like that, and realize that everything is connected to everything else. So it's this idea that we need an approach that doesn't have boundaries in terms of the modalities of developing knowledge, and we kind of need to be really multidisciplinary, and if we can, interdisciplinary as well, but that might be more challenging. But in order to tackle questions, address questions that are really quite challenging. So that was the spirit of it. May I just add a thing that I just come to my mind from a comment Beth made. I think it's been floating around. So one important thing about designing with animals and for animals as well is, and who we reach, who we don't, is somebody that is one animal representative of the whole species, or is just for themselves. When we do design, when we design for animals, we acknowledge that they have requirements that need to be met. When we put these designs in the environment, we have modified the world on their behalf, for them, and therefore we make their presence more conspicuous and more legitimate. And but designing with the animals is like recognizing that they have voices, and those voices must be heard. But even in the constrictions within which we have to move, those things make a difference. Those things make little difference, and maybe one difference time. They make a difference for an individual, maybe today, but they also now, for those who are external to the situation, to the context, they think, oh, switches for dogs, the ones that we installed in a restaurant. Oh, switches for dogs. Maybe the only dogs who use those switches, they're few individuals, I don't know, well, because you don't have very many mobility assistance dogs around. But those are switches for dogs, not for humans, for dogs. So the dogs are now reflected in the architecture of a place. And that makes a difference, that small thing. And it makes a difference for individual dogs who will interact with those, but also for a species, so yeah, sorry, that just came to my mind before I lost it again. So I thought I'd mention it. So.
Great, thank you. So I think there's one question left for Clara specifically from Adam. I'm not sure, Adam, if you wanted to ask your question or if you'd like me to read it.
Yeah, I can read it. Thank you so much for a really, really, really engaging, fascinating, just brilliant work. And also to Beth and Alice for really great discussion as well. And at the end there, when I think after you'd responded to the discussion points, you mentioned about failure being written into the design process and being able to understand the failure in this kind of co-design thing. And I wonder if you could maybe just elaborate a little bit on the ethical implications of this, whether this allowed us to see, I don't know, I think in terms of animals in research, how they're often seen for their use value, but this was, I don't know, I can't quite remember how I wrote it. Probably a bit better than that, but I wondered about the implications of this, and it seemed like a more ethical way to engage animals as collaborators or as co-designers, as you put it.
So I'll try to interpret and see if I interpret your question. So I think it is very valuable that there is a paradigm that values errors and failures, because especially, and usually those are failure on our part, the failures of the designers. So when, for example, when Charlotte was working with the dogs to do the alarm, and she thought, oh, we keep the tag attached, the dog pulls it a bit and then the tag stays there. And the dog were having none of that. The dogs were just grabbing the thing and, yanking it out. And that obviously, that was a message for us. That was just taking stock after, those literally, those breaches, those points of those breaking points, they tell us, here you need to change approach, you need to change something. He told you that doesn't work for him, he or she. Likewise, when Zina sat down in front of the, when I was saying, yeah, can you, touch, and she sat down there, and it's like, no, I've had enough. And so that tells me something, I need to take stock of that, and rather than pushing, just take it home and say, okay, obviously, that was a very obvious case, but there are cases that are a bit less obvious. So that there was a case where, again, Charlotte was working with the dogs. Again, the trigger, she had used a magnet trigger to, there's something pulled out and there's a magnet attached, and the poor dog was walking with, he pulled it out. So after she figured out the thing needed to detach, she designed something that detached, and it was a magnet. And then the dog walked past a cabinet, a filing cabinet, and the thing just got attached with the dog attached to it. And that was, you have these situations. Obviously, there was no harm done, because we always make sure that we wouldn't expose an animal to a situation that was, could be harmful for them in any way. But it is where those things don't work, where things don't work, you often learn the most. And so that's really, and that's when the animal often is when the animal is telling you, I'm using this in a very broad, this term in a very broad sense, because I don't think it matters that much that they are not actually verbally telling you, but but it's giving you input to show you that, to adjust your course. And those adjustments to the course that are extremely valuable for us. And they've often come from these, these failures, these errors, these things that don't work.
Great, thank you so much, Clara.
Thank you.
We have some remaining questions at the bottom. There are some from last week and a few from this week, which I'll just maybe open up to any of our speakers from last week or this week who feel like they want to jump in. So one from last week is, at what point should we pause in our attempts to know more about animals, even if co-production or collaboration might have certain benefits? So I think this was talking about, things like telemetry and the tensions between individual versus species benefits, but I think is applicable to other contexts as well. So does anyone have thoughts they want to share on sort of these limits to knowledge and limits to collaboration?
I suppose it's not, oh, sorry, Emma, go on.
Yeah, no, I just was thinking that like in some ways we've moved from the domesticated animals, and there was already kind of rampant exploitation and researching to use them, you know, from farming to laboratory, and now, and I don't really study this as much as many of you here, but moving to the kind of the wild animals, and then the domesticated pets who we weren't doing as much experimentation with, but now we realise that we can use them in lots of new ways, like, you know, human assistant dogs. So it feels as if in many ways we as a community are actually, you know, we're not really doing anything to stop this, are we? I think there's some really interesting questions around, and I think maybe Lauren and Johnny, you've kind of thought a bit about this, is like, how do we start to bring some more ethical protocols about the use of doing research with animals as collaborators? And I think that that's a really exciting area, and is it quite different from, say, the ethical regulation that we see, for example, in labs, Beth, in terms of like thinking about the role of the 3 Rs. And so when we think about how far we might move into that domain, I think there is actually a space for new ethical infrastructures to start to accompany some of these new areas of doing research.
Yeah, I probably read too much Douglas Adams, but I ever wonder if there's a cause for using the language experimentation with animals' relations with us as well, because sometimes the interactions we have with species that we don't always think feel quite experimental. So there's a brilliant piece by Erica Fudge called Pest Friends about her relationship with a house mouse, or the way in which it almost seems that some species seek us out for whatever reason. So sometimes sort of just experimenting with flipping the experiment round is an interesting process.
In terms of the wild animals as well, I always ask my research collaborators who track wolves, ask them, do you consider the wolves as collaborators? And I'm working through the data at the moment, but it throws up some really interesting responses. Some who just plainly say no, others who it really makes them stop and think, well, yeah, like this knowledge is formulated through the wolf as a moving being. And yeah, definitely it touches on a lot of what many people have said today about the kind of difference between the distance of wild animals and having to intervene in the impossibility of kind of knowing their mobilities and atmospheres without these technologies. Like Alice said, like you never encountered a wild dog, and I never encountered a wolf in my fieldwork either, and it makes you think actually how these knowledges are produced. It's very interesting.
Sorry, I'm just looking over at the mural again to see if there's any overlapping questions or folks who've asked multiple questions that align. I'm just going to read this one out. So thinking about the possibilities for more even collaboration, I'm interested in bringing in the concept of research. Do we consider that research might be something non-humans do? This sort of brings up the point that Beth just mentioned as well. To what extent are animals potentially, or other non-humans, researching or learning about us, and how does this shift the way we think about research? So I'm not sure if anyone has thoughts about that from their own work that they want to share.
Well, I could share something about the elephants in Kenya. Everybody says that elephants teach each other how to break fences and crop raid. And most of the crop raiding is done by male elephants, which move in groups, and there are old elephants that teach younger ones how to do it. At one point in this part of northern Kenya, they immobilized elephants and took them away to another area, which where they thought they would cause less trouble. And they started getting a lot of crop raiding starting over there, because the elephants that had moved taught all the elephants, or taught a certain selection of elephants, and the language, becomes very much, as I said, very much one of sort of vandalism and elephants that are a bad lot, rather like you might dismiss certain sort of human communities as sort of beyond the pale of reasonable civilized behavior, because conservationists expect elephants to lurk happily in the bush and not come and raid the farms of widows and orphans. So yeah, animals do learn and do teach, and it's very hard not to use that sort of humanized language to talk about what they're doing. And indeed, the people who work with them all the time and have no reason to police their language talk about elephants as if they were lovable but undesirable people, teenagers, naughty teenagers, who need to be managed for their own good.
I see quite a fascinating overlap there with the work I've done with Herdwick sheep in the Lake District, because there's a real sort of narrative, especially among the farmers, of multi-generational knowledge making between a Herdwick yow, a female sheep, and her children, teaching them their heft where they live on the commons. And farmers will tell you, if you set out a sheep on the wrong part of the common, they will find their way back over many, many miles to their one sort of quarter-mile radius of their heft where they belong. And there's obviously many different stories about if the sheep is troublesome or not, and there's a lot of politics in and ownership at play as well there, in terms of if it's good for the sheep to be on the common, how many sheep should be on the common, and how that affects the heft, because they know their way back in relation to their neighbouring flocks, etc. So yeah, that just reminded me of that.
Great. There's another question that I'm not sure if we want to come back to. We sort of started talking about this last week and a bit before the break today, about this idea about should collaboration be considered willful if not conscious? So how does it maybe relate to these ideas around individual intentionality and motivation? So we've talked, a bit about consent, of course, whether consent is required for something to be collaboration, whether ideas of temporality or understandings of the future nature of projects need to be part of this dialogue of collaboration. So I would just be interested in hearing anyone's thoughts. Can it be more sort of, I don't know, immediate or embodied or performative, or does it sort of have to tie into some of those other concepts?
So mentioning intent, and I missed the conversation last week, but it reminded me of a conversation we had quite recently with Tom Van Doring, and he was sort of drawing a line between agency being always linked to intent and agency being more about interest, which I think resonates in quite interesting ways with also the other term we've been working with, which is curiosity. And interest, quite an interesting one to work with, because it implies having a stake in something. And having a stake can be very intentional, yes, but it can always be unintentional. It's in your interest for things to happen in this way, not that way. So I think that interest is quite an interesting term to work with in this context.
Yeah, thank you. I like that, thinking about curiosity and interest as some other ways of approaching those more sort of humanist understandings of intent. Does anyone else have thoughts they wanted to share about that question? Or we've got about, well, 8 minutes left of our scheduling. If anyone has pressing questions they want to bring up now for any of our speakers or any of the themes of this week or last.
Curiosity, I think, speaks to what to a comment made in response to Bill's presentation last week about elephants that were attracted towards certain camera traps and technologies and fences and stuff. But it also speaks to a lot of what Clara was saying today, kind of with these different forms of indirect, direct, or daily collaborations, and just the idea of like the user experience being tailored towards dogs, which has to kind of factor in their curiosity. It's just a small comment.
May I make a comment? I also like the idea, because my concern is that notions of collaborations that involve intentionality in the way that we intend it, and then what do we need? What do we mean by intentionality? Do we have to have the same understanding of one situation, for example, which very often is not the case even among humans, you know? And so is that, as what I was saying, raising the bar, keeping the bar relatively high for something to qualify as collaboration, and the risk with that is that then we disqualify voices or interests that otherwise might need to be included. So I think the idea of interest is something that, you know, having a stake is really, in my view, also is perhaps the most important thing. And also, is what the other does influencing what I do? You know, that's, at the end of the day, if it does, if I influence what the other does and the other influences what I do, even if we have completely different understandings of what's going on, I've got mine, they've got yours, I've got what I want, they've got what they want. It doesn't matter, because there isn't in my experience, in opinion, a situation where even humans can ever get to a point where they both have the same understanding of a situation and they both get involved into a situation because they both exactly want the same thing. So I think this idea of the stake and are the parties influencing each other, and is change emerging as a result of that influence? To me, that is that would count as a form of collaboration.
Okay, that's really interesting. But if you put that into a human context, then a lot of things like a business exchange we would understand as collaboration. That isn't how we think of collaboration necessarily. You know, it's how we think about trade-offs or indeed conflicts. So I think
indeed, and that's the human, because that's the human understanding of collaboration. But if we want to engage with, you know, that beyond, I think we might need to revisit some of so there may be different forms of collaborations, you know, many different ways. Yeah.
I too like the idea of curiosity. Somewhere Foucault talked about you know, the benefits of curiosity, and curiosity being such a fantastic virtue. But I just wonder whether with curiosity and collaboration, obviously there's the collaboration, the theme here, but it is normatively sort of scripted, and plenty of others, non-human others, they research us in order to have nothing to do with us. They're not only are they sort of indifferent, and I sort of rather like that feline affect of boredom and indifference, and you know, that sort of idea you get, that you know, you're testing their patience from time to time, but plenty of animals have a curiosity about us, as it were, not in the sense of coming up, you know, to engage, but actually to sort of research us and then either ignore us or actually scarper and have nothing to do with us. So I wouldn't want that sort of language to be too. I'm being very anti-romantic today, but I wouldn't want it to be sort of too romanticized, and you know that we have to be a bit cautious about that. I'll lower my hand.
Great. Well, we're pretty close to the end here. I'll maybe give the opportunity for any final thoughts or questions before we wrap things up. All right. Well, if we're feeling good about that, then this has just been such a wonderful conversation. I can't tell you how much I've enjoyed listening to all of our speakers today. So thank you so much to Phil, to Clemence, and to Adam, and then especially Clara. Thank you so much for your delivering the keynote, and Beth and discussants. It was just I have so much to process, I think, coming away from this. So I did want to just mention that the mural is still there. So I think feel free to see that as a live document if anyone wants to return to it to pick up on some of the themes that we've discussed. And then we've also shared in the chat, there's a link to a Google document. The idea was just that if anyone wants to stay in touch around these topics or themes moving forward, feel free to add your email address. And then that's maybe a way that we can keep folks updated. And especially we will email out the links once we edit and upload these recordings. We'll let you know where those are. So thank you all so much. Johnny or Jenny, I don't know if